Welcome back to another recording of the Israel Connection, a live session where we unpack current events in Israel and focus on major events as part of a conversation. My name is Dean Baghdadi, and I'm the senior Shaliach at Pozez JCC. Let's begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Israel Connection, and we have very interesting headlines to talk about this week, starting with the reshaping of the status quo. Now, there has been a lot of headlines regarding the ultra-Orthodox in Israel upcoming in the past week. The majority of them was regarding a lot of incidents where women were asked to sit at the back of buses and public transportations or were withheld from entering either a train hall or a bus because it was said to be gender kind of like segregated. Now, this is a very, very problematic thing, to say the least, but I wanted to connect three dots, all regarding ultra-Orthodox, to talk about something much, much bigger, which is the reshaping of the status quo, and give a little bit of a background to what was used to be the relationship between the ultra-Orthodox and the secular majority of Israel, what it is today, and how it might change in the future, because I think that this is a very interesting topic to dive into. We've brought it up in several occasions in the past sessions when it was regarding the judicial reform or other aspects, but I wanted to really focus on that specific relationship of the ultra-Orthodox and how do they assimilate or don't assimilate with a broader society. And obviously, every time I've started talking about something that's complicated, I said that we're going to go back just a little bit far back, 1948, where all problems have started, with another one of the agreements, right, that was made in order to establish the Jewish state, the democratic Jewish state, which is Israel. And one of those agreements, right, one of the challenges the Zionist movement were facing, right, when trying to establish this new state, is to prove that it has a people. And to prove that it has a people, it has to prove that all the different, at least Jewish groups, are getting along. So there was a reporting committee made by the British mandate that came to see, right, along with the UN, that came to see, this is pre-1948. What is the relationship, and are the Jewish people are an actual people? And by then, in order to establish the new state, a status quo has been signed between the Zionist movement, which is much more affiliated with the secular movement, essentially, and the ultra-Orthodox, that the ultra-Orthodox will do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and the Israeli society is also will be trying to do 5, 6, 7, and 8, right? So there was several different sections of this agreement that were revolved around the public space, right? So one of them was that the ultra-Orthodox are not to be listed into the military service. They don't. The requirement of applied military service does not apply on them. It's not all ultra-Orthodox, but those who study in yeshiva, those who study Torah, as part of this kind of like relationship between the Jewish and the democratic nature of Israel. Another section of that agreement were regarding kashrut, saving kashrut in public administrations, in public offices, and in governmental branches, the army as well, and the police. Everything that is state-funded should be remain kosher. And one other thing was the rabbinate, the main institution that should dictate what is Jewish in the Jewish state of Israel. That's a lot of power. That is a lot of power concentrated in one establishment. And all of those together was part of what we refer to in Israel as the status quo, which is essentially the delicate balance between the democratic and the Jewish nature of Israel, which state exactly where the Jewish go over the democratic part. And it has been going on for 75 years now. And it seems like with the constitution that we've talked about, and like with the Palestinian conflict, everything seems to be rising all at once. And this one as well, it's the relationship between the Jewish and the democratic. And it aligns very well with the judicial reform as well, saying, right? And it is part of the larger polarization kind of like phenomenon we've seen in Israel. So if in the past everything was overlapping, and if you were one thing on this subject, you are probably on the other one on the other subject, and there weren't very distinguished camps. And this one there is. And if you're supporting the judicial reform, then you're also supporting more of the Jewish state. And if you're protesting against the reform, then you are siding with the more democratic state, democratic Jewish state of Israel. And again, this is very troubling because it creates camps. In the meantime, I've wanted to look through 3 different headlines, each one focused on a different thing, and try to talk about all of them together as part of that relationship. The first one is focusing on the first headline, starting from the one that is for Ynet. Record number of Haredi men joining workforce amid soaring cost of living. Now, if you know historically, Haredi men were not participating in the market flow. It was always on the brink of 30, maybe 40% of them working. And this week, a new headline came up that says it's a breaking ground 55% threshold for Haredi men working. Now, again, if you compare this to the overall employment rate of Jewish people, right, in Israel, the overall rate, or let's say the secular rate for Jewish employment is about 85%. It's a bit lower for the Arab society that is citizen for Israel. It's about 75%. And Haredi group, Haredi men are at 55%. Historically, Haredi women were more employed than Haredi men. Women were working, men were studying Torah. That was some of the relationship. Again, it is very difficult to try and group all Haredi together because it's very distinct by the different courts, right? Each one is specific and each one has a different rate of employment. Each one of them also engage with core value studies, right? Where we're talking about math, science, English. So it is varied, but they are all connected together. And it seems like a lot of different things have caused this threshold to rise very high for employment. One of those reasons is obviously the cost of living, the raging cost of living in Israel that is still increasing. It is much more expensive to live in Israel, to subsidize your family, to provide food and shelter for them. So it seems like both partners are now going to work. Other reasons for that are the current government saying that because the Orthodox representatives in the coalition getting a lot of value, a lot of money flowing to the Haredi groups, that might even be improving the rate because there seems to be almost an idea of ability to work and remain Haredi. There's a lot of different reasons to why this one has soared. There is. And it, again, as we said, it connected to a larger problem or challenge that we're seeing in Israel, which is the assimilation of the Haredi group. From the one hand, we have increasing employment rate for Haredi groups, which indicates assimilation. An ability to assimilate better within the broader society, employment rate is one of those signals that signs that. On the other hand, and this is an article came from the New York Times, we've obviously saw this all over Israeli media as well, increasing cases of segregations in buses for women. And this is a very alarming thing. Not necessarily just from Orthodox passengers, but also from bus drivers that were not letting people go on the bus, even though it's a public transportation, just because they were not dressed humble enough, or because they were just women and they were forced to sit on the back. In some cases, they were not even allowed to go on the bus. Now, this is a very, very alarming thing, especially if you're using the term segregation to try and kind of like compares this to historically here in the US, segregation by race, and saying that this is segregation by gender. And it is because we have not seen a reaction, like a strong reaction from politicians trying to say that this is a bad thing. We've obviously saw a comment from the Prime Minister. We obviously saw a comment from the Ministry of Transportation, both condemning these events. We've seen comments from all the bus companies saying that they will go and investigate each one of those cases separately. But the fact that we're seeing all of these cases coming together raises another question, which is what have changed, right? The numbers have not changed drastically in the past 5 years. The representation percentage of Haredi representatives in the Knesset has not changed as well. It remains stable. So if they did not grow in size and did not grow in representative number, why are we seeing more cases like this? And the answer obviously is both assimilation with the public, right? More and more Haredi groups are now participating within the public space. A different reaction as well could be that because of this right-wing government, because of its almost like enabling extreme voices to be heard, it seems like more people gaining confidence in try and approach this obviously very, very bad habit. And there could be a third reason, and it is that because of the polarity that we're seeing, people, again, as we said, siding with one side, which is the Jewish or the Democratic. And therefore, and in some of those cases that we've seen that were recorded by phones or by other uses, the bus drivers were not Haredi, but they were trying to protect Haredi feelings and therefore withholding for someone to go on the bus because of how they are dressed, or just because they were women, or forcing them to sit on the back. And it does raises a lot of questions regarding what should be the status quo now. Because on one hand, right, we want the Haredi group to be assimilated, right? We want them to have a high employment rate. We want them to have good education, and we want them to be able to move freely on the public space just like anyone else. But at the same time, when we want them to be assimilated better with the surroundings, we also want the public space to be safe for women. We want this one to be not discriminating, not segregating, and not forcing anyone to remove or to provoke some of its rights for someone else, right? It is a very, very challenging thing to see. And because of everything that's happening right now, because of the polarity of everything that's happening right now, this all emerges at once, both with the judicial reform and everything else that's happening. But it is part, to me, of a much larger phenomenon, which is kind of like the first feedback we're seeing from a much larger scale of assimilation of the Haredi group within the public space. A last change that I think we're seeing in approach is the fact that historically, Haredi group representatives were always passive and were trying to take care of their own, maintain money and funding for their Haredi groups, and not care so much about the public space. That was usually more of the religious Zionism kind of like role, to be a mediator or to take care of the Jewish in the public space, while the Haredi representatives were historically just trying to maintain and conserve situation as it is. And what we're seeing right now could indicate a change in approach as well for the Haredi group, trying to now care for the public space and not just their own. Yes, go ahead, Gabe.
I'm just curious, do Israelis see the conflict as between being Jewish and being democratic? Because that strikes me as just an awful conflict where at least some of the people think they can't be both. And certainly from a United States perspective, or maybe just from my perspective, it would just seem that being Jewish should automatically make you in favor of democracy.
That's a great question. And I think, again, as part of the polarity we're seeing in Israel, right, you are forced to choose sides. And if you're on one side of the judicial reform, if you're supporting Netanyahu, and if you're against a two-state solution, then that also might align with the religious conflict, which is you think Israel should be more Jewish than democratic. And even there is an extreme phenomenon of that, which was called the movement of separation that we've heard about in the recent weeks that says Israel cannot exist with both of those forces playing along because they simply don't align. If you're looking at the ultra-Orthodoxy type of Judaism, and you see that there's no place for liberal values, there's no place for women's rights, right? There is not a single women representative in the Haredi group parties. And if there's no room for, right, for all of those things, then Jewish and democratic do not align with each other. Now you can add another aspect, which is Judaism is different in Israel than here in the US. Here in the US, you have the majority of Jews affiliated with Reform movement, the majority of them. Again, there is a majority of Jewish people here in the US that are not affiliated at all, but within those who are affiliated, most of them are affiliated with the Reform. The other largest one is Orthodox, and the smallest one is conservative. In Israel, Judaism is almost 100% Orthodoxy. And if you do not align with the Orthodox values, then you are secular. And the majority of Jews in Israel are secular. They're Orthodox. Almost all shuls in Israel are Orthodox, but they are secular. There is a mid-ground called Masorti, which will translate into traditional, aligns a little bit with the conservative movements in the ways that it is trying to find a mid-ground between being very much religious and live a secular life. But when that's the option, right? Being Jewish means being ultra-Orthodox in Israel, and you don't align with that, then the other option you have is secular. And that's a different reality, not just a different kind of like shift in values. Yes, Phyllis, go ahead.
Yeah, what I was going to say, isn't there also a push now to have the ultra-Orthodox also serve in the military? And also to stop the supplements, that the massive supplements they get to study.
So again, this is part of a larger shift, which is part of the reshaping of the status quo. There is a law, the military, what's the word that I'm looking for? Obligation. You are forced to participate within the military. And that law was being legislated over and over again, trying to find a right number of Haredi groups that will not be forced to join the military. They will not have this mandatory military service applied on them. And every time that this law was being legislated, eventually it was canceled by the Supreme Court of being unequal. And again, there's arguments to whether or not that's the case, but every time it was legislated by the Knesset, it was eventually overruled by the Supreme Courts over the usage of inequality by saying you cannot just cancel someone's obligation or military service mandate just because of their religious beliefs, their circumstances of birth. It is unequal. And again, that goes also for the Arab society as well, that are not forced to join the military at the age of 18. Muslim Arabs. There is a small percentage of the Arab society which is called the Druze, and they do hold a mandatory military service, but the majority of Arabs do not join military and are not forced to. Some of them are even rejected from the military because of security issues or something else. But this is a different conversation. So specifically regarding military service, there has been a shift. And one of the reasons for that is that there is a timeline, there is an expiration date on the current military service law that were meant to be dated that way, so they eventually find a solution for that problem. And that date is coming very, very, very closely. I don't recall the exact date, but it's in the upcoming few weeks. And when that expires, then all ultra-Orthodox have to serve in the military. Now, is that actually going to happen? Are we going to see the police going and taking people to join the military? Probably not. But it is part of a larger problem, which is, again, the military service for Haredim, which is part of the larger problem, which is their assimilation in the broader society. There was a suggestion that was kind of like a compromise, saying everyone must serve, but not in the military. There is a thing called National Serve in Israel, where you go and volunteer for a year at a hospital, at social clinics, social work, being a teacher. There's a lot of different ways you can do that, but you are serving your country. You're just not doing a military role. And that was offered as kind of like a compromise. Everyone is obliged to serve. You don't have to serve in the military. At the moment, we don't see something of a sort. There's definitely an interest for the ultra-Orthodox representative within the judicial reform, because one of the sections that was offered in the judicial reform was to create an ability for the Knesset to overrule a decision made by the Supreme Court. And by that saying, we are going to legislate a new military mandate service law that will just eliminate military service mandate for ultra-Orthodox Haredi men that are studying, right? Everyone who study, call them Avrichim, will not serve in the military, will not have a mandatory service apply on them. And when that's going to be canceled by the Supreme Courts, the Knesset will have the ability to overrule that decision and end the whole thing, because this one is an ongoing thing for like 20 years. Trying to resolve that issue. And this is why the Haredi groups are so interested in the judicial reform. That is what they are gaining from that part, that specific issues of military service. But again, whether or not we're going to see a shift in this one, that's probably going to be in the next seat of the Knesset in September, along with the other steps for the judicial reform. And it's definitely going to have a lot of, it's going to raise a lot of anger. Because, right, if the majority secular Jewish people right now that are protesting against the reform, they're the one who paying the majority of taxes in Israel. They're the one doing the mandatory military service. They feel that they're lesser than Haredi people that don't pay their taxes or pay much, much less taxes. They're subsidized by the country. They don't serve in the military. And it is a very, very difficult situation, because what's that causing, and that goes with your comment, Gabe, is that if that's Jewish, then I don't want to be Jewish.
Let me ask another question. Do the Haredi not feel patriotism? Do they not feel loyal to Israel and recognize, as you just said, that it's the rest of Israel allowing them to practice Judaism as they want to? And if the army fails, if Israel fails, what happens to them?
That's a good question. And frankly, there's different approaches, right? Some Haredi groups don't believe that the current state of Israel is the Jewish state we've always dreamed of, because it's not mandated by the halakha. It is not constituted by the Bible. It is not following the rules of the Jewish court, and it is not led by rabbis, and therefore it is not a Jewish state. It's a democratic state. And democratic liberal values don't align with conservative orthodox values, right? Plurality and different voices and different approaches to life do not align very well if you think that there is one way to live your life, and it is by the halakha.
But
And if you
look at the neighborhood that they're in the Middle East. There are plenty of terrorist organizations that want to push Israel into the sea and destroy the Zionist entity. And
Mhm.
so it may not be Jewish perfect enough for them, but it's better than some of the alternatives they might face.
And a counter argument will be, if you want to maintain Israel as a democratic and Jewish state, someone has to study Torah. This is one of the most controversial things right now in Israel, right? And it is that equation. What do I do as a citizen and what do I gain from that? And that equation is changing, and that relationship is changing, and the perspectives are changing. And that's why we're seeing so much lashback, because this, right, add this up, all this tension that this one is causing, specifically what's happening with the Orthodox, to the judicial reform, to the security issues rising in Israel, and to the raging cost of living. And you will not be surprised why things erupt so harshly. It's because everything's happening, all the stuff that we hid under the carpet, all the issues that we try to sweep aside, rises all at once, creating those so many clashes. And again, the polarity doesn't help that, where if you're agreeing with the reform, then by extent you are also agreeing with ultra orthodox to not serve in the military and to give more money to yeshivas because you believe that studying Torah is more important than military service. It is a very, very troubling thing. And there's no nuances, right? It's part of that. It's a very troubling thing.
As an extremely secular Jew, let me ask a basic question. What's the goal of a lifetime spent studying Torah?
You're asking the wrong person. I can definitely understand the value of studying Torah and why some people must do that. And that was essentially part of the original agreement of the status quo, saying some folks should study Torah because Israel is a Jewish democratic state. And if it is a Jewish state, then some people are okay with studying the Torah and us as a country supporting them. It was part of the original agreement. But the numbers has changed, the statistics has changed, and now there's a lot of people that are studying Torah. And that raises the questions, what was the relationship when we started, what it is right now, and hopefully a really healthy discussion about what it should be. But at the moment, because of all the conflicts and because of all the polarity, we are not able to actually have that conversation that is necessary, how it's going to look like in 50 years. And again, I have to stay optimistic because I have nothing else but that. And to believe that, right? And that's why I've aligned all of those headlines together, because each one of them tells an individual story. But together, I say that it is a much larger phenomenon, which is a better assimilation of the Haredi group. And it is not going to be perfect. And everyone has to give up something, right? When we want to reach eventually a compromise. I'm not saying that all of this is right or wrong. In my perspective, this is definitely wrong, and this is definitely troubling and bad if you want to be a democratic country, especially for women. But at the same time, if we want to see Haredi groups assimilate better in the broader society, we need to know and we need to think and we need to talk about what it's going to look like. And move on to the next, which is the Arab society in Israel. Now, we have been told about it in the again in the past few sessions, and I wanted to focus on recent headlines, which is the defunding of Arab colleges in East Jerusalem. Now, this aligns again with the broader policy of the right-wing government. which is essentially canceling everything that the previous government did. And one of those agreements was a looking ahead program that was supposed to create more and more opportunities for Arab individuals through education. And it was to fund not only Arab colleges, but Arab towns, Arab municipalities, and provide them with more and more infrastructure for them to eventually be a more self-sufficient individuals and reduce crime, reduce violence, and reduce inequality within the Arab society, because they will assimilate better within the broader society if they will have a good starting point, if they have an advantage. This was started in the previous government, that it was part of a larger program that was supposed to be funding not just education institutions, but also other infrastructures that are needed for that to happen, whether it's transportation or others. And in the past week, we've saw headlines coming in from the Ministry of Treasury and Minister of Treasury, specifically Smotrich, defunding those programs specifically for East Jerusalem, maintaining inequality and preventing opportunities from Arab citizens. Now, East Jerusalem is a very, very unique case. We need to, when we think about Arab society in Israel and Palestinians in general, East Jerusalem is a unique case because the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Ayosh, are monitored by the PA, the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, along with the military in Israel and a branch of it called the civil administrations, they manage the civil life within those areas. They are the one in charge of the daily life. Who takes out your trash, who builds your roads, who cleans who trims your trees, and who build the pavements. In Gaza, right, 20 years ago, elections was made, and that was meant to be Hamas, which is a terror organization, and it does so horribly. East Jerusalem is a unique case because East Jerusalem is not part of Judea and Samaria. It is not part of the West Bank. It is part of Israel, but the residents there are not considered to be citizens, and it is under the authority of the municipality of Jerusalem. The mayor of Jerusalem is in charge of East Jerusalem, even though East Jerusalem residents are not citizens of Israel. They are in a unique case of residency without citizenship. And essentially what's that causing is major inequality. Major inequality, a very, very violent and poor community. And one of the main efforts that previous government was trying to do is to create better starting points for those folks. And one of them was that program that was supposed to be funding academic purposes and academic colleges. Now, East Jerusalem is about a 50-minute drive from the Hebrew University, one of the best universities in Israel. And one of those programs was made to create better transportations for folks to then go and study in that university. Smotrich in the past week has froze those funds that was supposed to be diverging to East Jerusalem by saying, by giving them money, we're supporting terror, because we've seen terror acts coming out of East Jerusalem. And this is a very, very complicated case because on one hand, we have seen violence emerges from that place. It has. But at the same time, if it's not going to be Jerusalem municipality and essentially the government of Israel, no one else is going to be in charge of that area. And there's a few thousands of residents there, 10,000s, I think almost 100,000. And this obviously caused a lot of lashbacks from the public as well, saying, this is not helping. If you want to fight terror, if you want to fight violence, you need to create better opportunities for those people. And on the other hand, which is, again, the point that Smotrich is coming from, you can't take away money that was made in Israel and transfer it to people that don't believe Israel should exist. And there are folks there as well, right? I've heard a really, really interesting example that we're examining exactly that. And it was within the educational system of East Jerusalem. The curriculum that they're studying is manufactured by the Palestinian Authority, the same way that schools in the Palestinian Authority are studying, but it goes through censorship in Israel in order to eliminate every factors that discourage Israel as a legitimate state, which creates a very, very unique curriculum that is kind of like, that is weird, just weird, right? It was created by the Palestinian Authority. Some of the content that's there is definitely delegitimize Israel as a Jewish democratic country. And then it goes through Israel's Ministry of Education to eliminate those content, but still remain the program as a whole. And those schools are now being defunded because of that. But it raises the questions, what should be the proper arrangement for this area? Should it be under the PA? Should it be under Israel? There has to be a solution. And we're not seeing a solution. We're just seeing just an advancement in this specific area, which is now defunding those institutions. With the criticism again goes as, that's not helping. That's making things even worse. It is a very, very difficult situation. And again, it also reminds us of how diverse the Arab society in Israel really is, right? Because there are Arab citizens that live in other places in Israel. There is East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza. Each one is different, and it's a unique situation. Yes, go ahead.
I am surprised that I did not know that Israel had actually occupied East Jerusalem after the 6-Day War, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet they have not incorporated East Jerusalem to the rest of Israeli society, including the Arabs that live other places in Israel. That I think it's a shock to many American Jews that hear this for the first time. Why? Because Israel has already many problems. I mean, international recognition by other people and the Palestinian issue and all that stuff. And the least they can do is incorporate how many thousands of so-called Palestinians live in East Jerusalem?
I don't know the exact number. I encourage you to check. Oh, we have someone in the chat says population in East Jerusalem is 580,000 inhabitants. 61 of them is Arab Palestinians and 31 is Jewish. Thank you, Suzanne, for that comment. That is a lot of people, right? And if 61% of them are identifying as Arab or Palestinian, then that's 270, 200, almost 300,000 people. That's a lot of people that requires a very, very complicated solution in order to achieve some form of agreement. Thank you for that, Susan. I appreciate it.
Israel should make the necessary arrangements not to antagonize any more than they already are antagonizing other people around the world, with regards to the Palestinians. The world doesn't know about East Jerusalem and all that. They think Jerusalem is one big city and east, west, north, south, whatever, it's all one.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it should have been, it should correct that and deal with other issues that they have with Hamas and other Arabs, surrounding them, which is also a problem. So I'm really surprised at that, Dean, to be honest with you.
Um,
not-
will be resolved in the near future? I don't think so, especially not with this right-wing government, because essentially they're doing what they promised, right? The Zionist movement, religious Zionism, specifically that party, and not the Zionist movement as a whole, has promised that exactly that. This is part of Smotrich agenda. This is part of the statesmanship that he has been following for decades now. Only now he has more power because he is a prominent member of the coalition. And whether the coalition likes it or not, and that's another argument, what should be the policy lines for a right-wing government? They do that. And that raises another problem. Thank you for that kind of like Gaza Harama lift back for the next headline, which is the agreement with Saudi Arabia. That is definitely going to be a challenge for that one. We've talked a little bit last week about this ongoing historical agreement between Israel, America, and Saudi Arabia. And we've talked about the fact that right-wing coalition, Netanyahu's coalition partners, are going to make his life very, very difficult to get that agreement, because Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, is accepting concessions from Netanyahu's government, is accepting some advantages for the Palestinian or some recognition from his coalition, not just him himself, from the Israeli government, in order to reach that agreement. And that is a challenge for Netanyahu. That's definitely a challenge, because Netanyahu, as much as he liked to prescribe himself as right-wing prime minister, he was always center-right. And he always prefers to preserve a certain situation rather to make for at least right-wing reforms. He was always more cautious and preservant rather than reformists, especially when it comes to governmental actions and security actions. We've seen that all along his reign. And but his government, his coalition, his right-wing government, especially the Zionist, religious Zionist branch, is pushing for not necessarily annexation, but definitely positive steps toward investments in settlements and recognition in more and more settlements in C territories and B territories and territories that are controversial. And at the same time, if you want to see any type of recognition from Saudi Arabia, there has to be some concessions made by the government, and this will makes it much more difficult. And in addition to that, the Saudi Arabia, and I think that this is a very much reaction to an interview Netanyahu gave last week, saying the Palestinian will not be an issue for this agreement. That's a headline that came from his interview. Was interviewing for Bloomberg, I think it was called, an international media company. I think it was American. And he said that they're not going to be the challenge to this relationship. And I think we're seeing this one as a reaction, and I'm talking about the headline from CNN World saying, Saudi Arabia appoints first envoy to Palestinians amid talks on Israel normalization. Saudi Arabia has appointed their already existing Jordanian ambassador to also be the ambassador for the Palestinians, encouraging the connection Saudi Arabia has with the Palestinians. And of course, we mentioned that before as well. Saudi Arabia supports the Palestinian and the Palestinian cause. Definitely much, not just in faith and ideas, but also in actions, and financial support is part of them. And by doing that, by appointing their envoy to the Palestinians, they are making it very, very clear that the Palestinians are not going to be a small part of this agreement. They're going to expect big, real concessions from Netanyahu's government if they want to see anything happening. On the Israeli side, we have not seen any advancement regarding this relationship. And obviously, from the American side, from Biden's administration, an agreement with Saudi Arabia is a huge win, especially when primaries and elections are right around the corner. And this type of agreement is a really big thing. Now, again, we've talked a little bit about what it will require from the US as well. We've talked about a military pact between the US and Saudi Arabia. We've talked about agreeing for Saudi Arabia to develop nuclear abilities for power reasons, but again, still nuclear abilities. And we've talked about huge arms deals between them. That is going to affect definitely the internal relationship between Israeli government, coalition, and opposition. And we've already seen headlines saying that some opposition members are willing to participate in a unity coalition with Netanyahu just for that agreement alone, while we've saw what happens to unity governments with Netanyahu. They collapsed.
Dean, there's one other component that I think needs to be mentioned, and I don't know if the rest of the group knows about this or not, but
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia has entered into an agreement with China and Iran. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about it last week
Yeah.
about the diplomatic relationship that Saudi Arabia and Iran established. And we have not mentioned at all the geopolitical situation that Saudi Arabia is in. We might focus on that one on the next one, right? There's a difficulty in relationship for Saudi Arabia between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, which is bordering, not Syria, sorry, Iran,
Sure.
Iraq, and Yemen.
So, so why would Saudi Arabia get involved with so many different groups of people, and then at the same time trying to establish some relationship with Israel by protecting the Palestinians from anything? That's the way I see it in terms of nobody can make the Palestinians work with Israel in a proper fashion. Nobody. Perhaps Saudi Arabia could play that role.
That's a good question. That's a good comment. There's a lot of arguments regarding this one, but I can say that Saudi Arabia can gain a lot from this agreement as well, right? Israel as a desert country and Saudi Arabia as a desert country has a lot to gain from technology and power, either startup companies, high-tech solutions, a lot of technologies that Israel is an expert on to support Saudi Arabia and its battle with climate, especially as an arid desert country. So again, each side has a lot to gain from this agreement, everyone, and each side has a lot of complexity that adds to that agreement. And it's very interesting to keep up. Now, right before we're finishing this week's session, as we always do, we cannot stop just on the complicated bad things, but also focus on the good stuff that's happening. And something good is happening next week. August 24th, we're going to do a cooking culture session of Hungarian dumplings, gombots. Well, I'll demonstrate how to make that recipe. And I've made a few tests already, and it's improving. While also talking a lot about the history of the Hungarian Jewish community. And also remind you all that Golden Movie is coming up August 25 on screens. There's a sneak peek on August 23rd. I don't know if they have any tickets left, but you can go out to our website. You can sign into the cooking culture session. You can look for tickets for Golda as well. This is going to be very, very interesting. I want to thank you all for joining this session and participating, commenting. It is really, really important to me, and I'm glad to see you all. And I hope to see you all next week as well.